All right, so episode 4 has dropped, and wow, the callbacks are so many and so potent, so I'm just going to jump right in. Now, you'll remember that at the end of the last episode, we saw Daryl fall through the floor. One thing that I want to point out is that anytime we see someone in this show break the plane, meaning they're on one level, say, of a house, and then they fall through the floor to a different level, that always represents them falling into the underworld in some way. So, a really good example of this is that we saw Rick and Michonne fall through the floor of they were on top of the school building in 712, which was called Say Yes, and they fell through to the bottom. Now, nothing really happened to them, and same thing here. Daryl was fine, even though he fell through the floor, but it represents symbolically falling into the underworld, which is death, right? So in 712, the reason they showed that was that both Rick and Michonne were eventually, it was foreshadowing them experiencing some kind of death. In Rick's case, it's because he disappeared and Michonne thought he was dead. He kind of went into the realm of the underworld in terms of where she believed him to be. Her death was much more symbolic in that she closed the doors of Alexandria. She became very shut down. She kind of stopped, quote unquote, living and was just surviving for a while. So it was more of a emotional or spiritual death for her, but that's still what it symbolized. And we've seen this plenty of times. One thing that was pointed out to me that I didn't think of last week was that Daryl falling through the floor was actually very similar to what we saw at the big spot in 401. It was not him in that case that fell through the floor, but there was a walker who came through the ceiling and was hanging, right? It's kind of a famous, iconic shot. And this was a little bit like that, except in this case, it was him falling through the floor. Now, because of the helicopter on the roof of the big spot, excuse me, which we think represents the CRM, the walker falling through the floor was more likely to represent Beth. But in this case, we've got Daryl. Now, I have so much to say about this opening scene. It was so interesting the way that it played out. It was something that we were waiting for because it had been in the preview and there were people talking about it. You could kind of tell some of the reviewers when they were talking about the scene. And the funny thing is, they were talking about it like it was really ridiculous, and they thought it was dumb, basically, that Laurent could somehow ward off walkers by prayer. And the funny thing is, it ended up being a dream sequence, so it wasn't even real. I don't know what the reviewers were so up in arms about. I actually was looking forward to it. I thought it was a cool scene, and then it didn't end up being an actual real thing that was happening. So anyway, but it was interesting. But like I said, there's quite a few things I want to say about this, okay? The first thing that jumped to mind is that in this case, Daryl was dreaming because he passed out, apparently, when he hit the water. But he came really close to dying. I mean, there were walkers in the water. He woke up underwater. That's got to be frightening. So it was also kind of a near-death experience. And very recently, when Emily's, the video for her song came out, B or C for Effort, that one, she posted on social media that it was not supposed to be a dream sequence. It was supposed to be a near-death experience. And that was a little bit bizarre because in the music video, it's very clearly a dream sequence. Like, she literally goes to sleep at the beginning and wakes up at the end. So if they're going for it being a near-death experience, that would be totally symbolic and it would be an interpretation. There's nothing in the music video that literally says it's a near-death experience. So of course we all thought that was really interesting and really strange. Like, maybe she's hinting at something Beth related, So that just came to mind here. I'm not saying that needs to be connected to this particular scene, but that's just what it reminded me of. This thing where he sees Laurent pray the walkers away was a dream sequence, but it was also kind of a near-death experience for Daryl. And, you could argue it was a near-death experience for Laurent in the dream. He almost died by the walkers, but he didn't. So that was just really, really interesting. And the fact that it was a dream sequence and not real, I didn't expect that. The other thing that, I was going, okay, there's a deeper symbolism here than Daryl just having some random dream, obviously. But what we're really seeing, if you kind of zoom out from a bird's eye view, is that Laurent used faith to save himself from the walkers. And that does feel like a commentary on Beth. Like, she saved herself from being surrounded by walkers. So we believe during the missing 17 days that, you have those 800 walkers that were brought in to film Coda, and of course we never actually saw them, so we believe that's part of the missing 17 days, that the walker horde comes through and that's where they left her behind, in which case she would have been surrounded by walkers, much like Laurent was here, except she was probably in a car. But the point is, Faith is always Beth, right? That she's always going to be the person represented by that. And it was Faith that saved Laurent from the walkers. And very specifically, Daryl could not save him. He could not get to him. He was locked behind a gate. And then the other interesting thing is that at the end of the dream, it doesn't just end with Laurent standing there or Laurent doesn't come toward Daryl. He leaves. So we also have this representation of Laurent being surrounded by walkers, much like Beth was, being saved somehow, and Daryl being shocked that he was saved, and then Laurent leaves. And it's like, so did Beth. Like, she disappeared, and he didn't see her again after that. So it was a really interesting dream. Then he wakes up in the water, and that in and of itself is really symbolic. I mean, him coming up out of the water is baptismal symbolism. And the thing is, baptism symbolism is actually just another form of resurrection symbolism. And the reason I say that is because even in terms of religion, that's the way they teach it, is that baptism, the idea is that you go under the water, it helps to wash away your sins, and you come up as a new person, but coming up from the water is a form of symbolic resurrection. That's, Christian religions who teach it, that is the way they talk about it. That is the way they teach it. So we have Daryl falling into the water, kind of getting resurrected, and he does fight with death in the water. He fights with two different walkers. One of them, at the beginning, he just stabs him in the side of the head. The second one, which tries to bite his foot, and that's another big symbol. I mean, Beth hurt her foot. There's a lot of foot and leg symbolism going on. He doesn't leave anything behind. Like when the shoe is left behind or the foot is left behind, and when that happens, it's usually a walker foot that can actually come off. That usually is a foreshadow of separation. So I don't know if that's what they were going for here, and it actually could be. Even though he didn't leave his foot behind in any way, we didn't see him leave a shoe behind or anything, it did go after his foot and kind of bit him on the shoe, even though obviously that didn't actually harm him. But at the end of this episode, he does split with Lizzie. So him and Isabel go their separate ways. So it could have been like a very small foreshadow of that, but I'm not sure. Anyway, the second walker, he does stab it in the eye, which becomes serious symbolism. So there was just so much symbolism going on here. I really, really loved that opening sequence, and I had to watch it several times to really kind of internalize all of it. Okay, so after that, Daryl goes back into the city, and we have another really interesting part. Now, the first time that I watched the episode, I tend to just write down what's actually happening, and part of that is just so that I have the sequence in front of me so that I can go through it chronologically when I'm doing these breakdowns, but then I kind of have to watch it a second time and kind of relax my brain a little bit more so that the symbolism can sink in. So all I wrote down the first time was that he sees someone playing the cello, and then he sees an elderly couple, and, then the episode just keeps going, and it's a little bit random because they don't actually seem to be part of Falou's group or anything like that. Like, it's just like these really random people that he sees. The cellist is playing a very famous song. I need to look up the name of it because I don't have it in front of me right now, but most of you will probably recognize it. But the second time, what occurred to me is that he hears someone playing music, right? Music always goes back to Beth. And then he looks over, and this elderly couple is clearly married or something. I mean, it looks very romantic, like they're eating dinner, and then she touches his face, and they seem to be a married couple, right? So after coming up out of the water, the resurrection symbolism, or the baptism symbolism, if you prefer, Daryl hears music, and he sees a married couple. I mean, to me, that's just saying that the person that played the music, and then all this focus about Daryl finding his soulmate and marriage and does he have a wife? You know what I mean? It's showing us that he's getting there. He's coming up on this to where he's going to finally find the person he's going to be married to, but the music is involved, right? Someone playing the cello. And that was right after the near-death experience when he saw Laurent, who I think in that case represents Beth, being saved after being surrounded by walkers. So it's just one great big foreshadowing, which I really enjoyed. I always love it when they give sequences to us that confirm what we think is going to be happening anyway. All right, so then we see that Janae and Cordon are interrogating Falou's people, especially the widow. She's sitting at the table. They're asking where Daryl is and where the boy is. One thing I totally missed that W.D. Way picked up, she's got the eagle eyes, is that there is a spoon on the table in front of the widow. Now, the spoon, we always link that back to Beth because of the DC spoon. There's also what looks to be something with a black handle sitting next to the spoon. It's probably a knife. But if that's the case, then we also have the black and white symbolism with Beth being the spoon and Daryl probably being the knife. So that's always really fun to see. I had heard that Janae was going to threaten the life of the baby, who, Falou talked about being the 64th member or something like that. She didn't really openly threaten her here. I thought it would be a more obvious threat to the baby. And don't get me wrong, there was obviously an undercurrent of it. The fact that she just took the baby away from its mom and she's a dangerous person. Not that there wasn't an insinuation there, but I just kind of expected it to be more on the nose, like she was going to hold a knife to the baby and say, tell me where he is, or I killed the baby or something. And she didn't do that. But here's the thing, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more. The baby was wearing yellow, bright yellow. We always associate yellow with Beth. And I'm not saying Beth is necessarily the baby, but here's the thing. I'm going to talk about this later in the week. You're going to see me answer and ask about it. Yesterday, I recorded a whole bunch more answers to asks, and I will be posting those this week just like I did last week. It seems to be working pretty well to do it that way. But one person sent something in which they showed the parallels between Beth and Daryl's journey in season 4 and 5 and Daryl and Isabel's journey. So everything from the prison falling to Beth ending up at Grady, we've kind of seen parallels to that in the Daryl Dixon spinoff. So the prison falling is mirrored in Isabel's convent home falling, being attacked, and then they have to leave, right? There's a detour when Beth goes looking for booze, and so they kind of detour to the golf club and then the moonshine shack, and then we have Daryl and Isabel detouring where they visit the kind of crazy conductor guy, hoping he had a radio, and he didn't. Him and Isabel get in a big fight, over her giving into Quinn and her saying, I don't need a hero. Beth and Daryl had a big fight, and there was talk of her being able to take care of herself. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of parallels, and we're seeing that. And I believe that we continue to see those parallels in this episode. So if, as we've also talked about, Janae is representative of Dawn, then we have Dawn who goes and picks up and holds this baby, and this baby is wearing yellow. So it still represents a threat to somebody who was wearing yellow, and we know that was Beth. So it was just kind of interesting. The other thing she says here is that she calls it false hope, but the hope they have in Laurent is a disease that needs to be rooted out. It just still sounds like something that Dawn would say, let's put it that way. All right, so then we see Daryl, he's trying to get back to Isabel's apartment, and he can't figure out where it is. There's a map, which did kind of call back to the Terminus maps, but in this case it's so faded, Daryl can't make heads or tails of it. He ends up running into the pigeon guy, whose name I don't know. Oh, but before that, I actually put that he walks past a lot of bikes. Bikes are a potent symbol. And he also sees this kind of skeletonized graffiti version of the Mona Lisa, which I'm sure is a foreshadow of them going to the Louvre. I will say that there are a lot of quote-unquote ladies of art in this episode, and I'll go into that in just a minute. So here's the thing, is he basically loses Laurent 2 different times. The first time actually happened last episode because, he went one way so that he could fight Cordon, and Laurent took off on his own. And, in this spinoff, Daryl doesn't quite realize Laurent is missing until this episode when he gets back, when he comes together with Isabel and she tells him that she hasn't been able to find Laurent. But either way, this wasn't Laurent being taken in this case. It was just them getting separated. So that could mirror Beth and Daryl getting separated, which, I don't know. I guess she was taken when they were separated in Alone. But it's kind of the first time that they are not in the same place. So that's important. And then we have Isabel and Daryl searching for Laurent. And what I noticed is that they pass a red van. And the reason that that's important is because there's this kind of famous picture from Consumed where Daryl and Carol are in Atlanta and they run past a red car with the door open. So this is very, very much a mirror of Daryl and Carol looking for Beth. And in this case, it's Daryl and Isabel looking for Laurent. Now, before I go forward anymore with that, we do need to talk about when he comes into the apartment and Isabel's there and she hugs him. Yes, I know people are going to be saying that it was a romantic hug, but it wasn't. I do think he was a little bit awkward about it. And I know I said before that his awkwardness can often show romance, but in this case, I really think that it was meant to be sort of a callback to 401 and the awkwardness of that hug. I mean, in a literal way here, it's probably because she's a nun and he was just kind of surprised that she hugged him. But I do think that maybe it's meant to be a callback to hugging Beth in 401. Like, that's just what it reminded me of more than anything else. And no, I still don't think that anything romantic is going on there. In fact, they kind of confirmed that there wasn't, because Sylvie asked Isabel outright and she said no. So that is pretty good confirmation that that's not where they're going with it. But you know that there's going to be an uproar about the hug, so I knew I had to mention it. Let's see. Do I have anything else to say about the pigeon guy? I mean, birds are a pretty potent symbol of Beth. And the guy did ask Daryl to free the birds, which was kind of interesting. I need to do kind of more of a deep dive into that. But he, especially the fact that he died, he reminded me a little bit of Percy from Grady. And I don't think Percy actually died. He was hurt pretty badly, but he was kind of the same age and looked similar. And Beth just had a lot of sympathy for Percy, and Daryl had a lot of sympathy for this guy, so it reminded me of Percy in that way. Anyway, so then I'm a little bit out of order here. He finally makes it back to the apartment with Isabel, learns that Laurent is missing, but he thinks that he might have gone to the Eiffel Tower, so they start looking for him. And that's when they pass the red van. So then we have this interesting little conversation where Anna comes in and starts talking to Quinn. And she says that she has a friend who harvested some truffles. Now, in this case, she doesn't mean chocolates. She means mushrooms. And mushrooms are something that we've noticed here and there. They're not a huge symbol, but we only get them once every couple of seasons. But it usually, we think, means that someone is... mushrooms can be hallucinogenic, so they're operating under some sort of, like a veil of being deceived in some way, or that they are mistaken about something, kind of symbolically hallucinating about something. And I'm not sure what the mushrooms are meant to refer to here, but it is Anna who speaks them, and you can see that this relationship she's in with Quinn is very one-sided, and she kind of is clinging to the hope that he actually cares for her when he doesn't. It could represent actually a lot of things that, Quinn is also deceiving a lot of people. He's deceiving Janae. He says he doesn't have Laurent when he does. And, Isabel is about to come back to him, not because she cares at all about him, but in order to save Laurent. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on here. I also did notice that she said that the guy who harvested the truffles made a pasta out of them. And we definitely have some pasta symbolism. We have Herschel's famous spaghetti line. We also had Carol in 602 mentioning, well, I guess it was the lady at Alexandria was wanting a pasta maker. And so they kind of had that going on there. So I'm not saying I've never been able to nail down exactly and define what the spaghetti or pasta symbolism is about, but we've seen it before, and we saw it again here. Meanwhile, Laurent does make it to the Eiffel Tower, but of course things don't go well. There's a lot of walkers behind sandbags under the base of it, and they come spilling out. And once again, this kind of reminds me of... I think it could be a representation of the missing 17 days, because walkers just come out of nowhere and kind of overwhelm the people that are there. Now, of course, Daryl and Isabel get there and start fighting them, but then Laurent hides under a piece of roofing, I think it is, and then is found and pulled out and taken by somebody. So it just feels like maybe them hiding Beth in a car so that the walkers can't eat her, and then somebody comes and picks her up and takes her away. And then we literally have, Laurent being taken away in the car. And, of course, that ties more to the first time Beth was taken, when she was taken away from Daryl and alone. But he literally watches that car drive away the same way he did in Still. The only difference is he doesn't run after it right away. In Alone, I said Still, didn't I? So this part was just really interesting. So many callbacks to Beth being taken away from Daryl. But again, even though there's a clear callback with him being taken in a car to Beth being taken away and alone, I still think that this could represent the second time that Daryl lost her, which was after she got shot. Again, because this is like the second time he got separated from Laurent. The first time, it was because Laurent took off and he search with him with Isabel, which is the Carol stand-in. So it's like kind of like them searching in Consumed. And then he found Laurent. He saw him for just a second, but then Laurent got ripped away from him again. And he was like reaching for him even and couldn't get a hold of him. So it feels similar to seeing Beth just very briefly at Grady. And then she just kind of slips through his fingers and he can't, quite save her in the way he wanted to. So there's that. And then, of course, just the fact that Isabel's there, when it happens, and Carol would have been there when it happened, whereas the first time it was a little bit different. So that's just kind of what it felt like to me. But definitely some really, really potent callbacks. So then we see them interrogating Armand. And, okay, here we go with this. So first of all, he calls Isabel a slut and says some not very nice things about her. And that's actually how she figures out that he's one of Quinn's guys, because Janae probably wouldn't say that about her. It just wouldn't, she wouldn't have any reason to. It wouldn't really serve her. And so it makes Isabel realize that this is one of Quinn's men and Quinn is the one that told him that. But there's still a parallel there between Beth and Isabel, because this guy is kind of assuming that she's a skank, I guess, and that, there's some sort of sexual element here, and it just feels like a parallel to Gorman a little bit. You've got a bad guy who's saying sexual things to her. But then we get, when Armand won't talk, we get a really interesting story from Daryl. He starts talking about a kid he knew named Jimmy who was bullied for being small. But then one Christmas, Jimmy got a piglet. And this piglet was like his best friend and followed him around like a little puppy dog, right? Oh, man, lots of symbols in this. And so he talks about how his father, who was always a drunk, by the way, interesting little detail to throw in, wanted to eat the piglet for Christmas and told Jimmy that if he didn't kill the pig, that his brother was going to get a beating. So Jimmy tried, and he tried to do it in a way that would be quick and painless and not harm the pig, but by doing that, he actually ended up inflicting more pain and torturing the poor little pig, and it screamed all night and then eventually bled out and died. So in the first episode, I think, there was a mention of some kid Daryl knew in school who was like Laurent and got beat up for it. And now we're hearing about another kid that Daryl knew that got beat up. So the first assumption is that Daryl's talking about himself in the third person. This is probably a story about him. And I talked to W.D. Way about this. We kind of went back and forth about whether Jimmy was meant to be Daryl or possibly Merle. I mean, the way that he talked about, his brother was going to get a beating made me think it might be Merle. And I don't know that Daryl would have tortured the pig. I mean, I don't know that he would have been able to bring himself to do it. Even Merle told Carol that Daryl was always the sweet one, even when they were little kids. But I don't know. It could be either one. It kind of makes more sense that it was Daryl. But whether it was Daryl or Merle, it doesn't really matter. The point is more the symbolism. Okay, so first of all, the pig is a symbol we've seen for a long time, since season 4. I think especially when it's a piglet, it's meant to be something that is innocent. You remember in season 4 when there were too many walkers pushing on the fence and they were afraid it was going to collapse. So Rick basically sacrificed these little piglets to draw the walkers away. So, I mean, we've seen pigs used in other capacities too, but in both cases, they were sacrifices to draw walkers away and save somebody else, okay? So, in the case of the story Daryl's telling, he has to sacrifice this pig, and stringing it up and letting it bleed out just feels a little bit crucifixion-y, and he did it to save someone else from getting a beating. So you see how it's very similar. And a lot of people talk about Beth as being a sacrifice of some kind, even though obviously they didn't sacrifice her on purpose. She was wearing a crucifix on her wrist in the hallway in Grady, which, this was like her symbolic crucifixion. And then Father Gabriel in 5:16, which was Conquer, the finale of season 5, started screaming at Sasha about how they had sacrificed one of their own. And to this day, we do not know exactly what Father Gabriel was talking about there. There's really nothing that happened in season 5 that we saw that matches what he said. So we don't know what was going through his head when he said that, but it's probably something that happened during the missing 17 days. And that's why we're like, okay, what the heck does that mean? Because we haven't seen it yet, right? So there's a lot of suggestion that Beth was sort of a symbolic sacrifice in some way. So then there's the fact that he says he got this pig for Christmas. Remember that in Still, Daryl mentioned Christmas in the I Never game. He said, I never got nothing from Santa Claus. So we've always seen Santa Claus and Christmas as a symbol of Beth and Daryl, and that maybe the idea that what he'll, symbolically get for Christmas is he'll get her back. So this is something that he got for Christmas, and that's why I do think that the pig symbolically represents Beth. And he says that he tried not to hurt it, but ended up hurting it worse, basically. And that just feels like a symbolic statement of Daryl's grief over not being able to save her. Like he tried to help her. He tried not to let her get hurt. And that's kind of what he did by agreeing to Tyrese's plan instead of Rick's. He didn't want to go in with guns blazing to Grady because he was afraid that either Beth or Carol or both could get shot. And by doing it that way, she ended up, in his mind, dying anyway. He ended up hurting her worse in his mind. Again, this is just his grief talking. And in his mind, she died, much like the pig did. So symbolically, I mean, this is really, really potent that he's talking about this. And then when Isabel asked if it was him, he says, no, I made all that up. But I don't think he did. I think it was a real story about either him or Merle. But it was also pretty random for them to have him telling that story while he's torturing this guy, right? Trying to get information out of him. He certainly could have just stabbed him and probably still gotten the information. He didn't really need to say all that. So they're putting it in on purpose, and just really, really heavy symbolism going on there. So that was really interesting to hear. I listened to that 2 or 3 times. We also see Laurent eating candy with Quinn, which I think is a callback to the candy at Grady with Beth, the lollipops that Noah was leaving for her. And Laurent has already worked out that Quinn is his father, which is kind of interesting. He's a clever kid. So they basically put together this plan to go and try to get Laurent back from Quinn. They're going to have Falou and several of his guys, including Emile, who is the guy that Sylvie has been hanging out with. They're going to go to the front entrance in front of the club where they first entered and basically attack and create a diversion. Meanwhile, Isabel and Sylvie are just going to go wait at the river, and Daryl is going to go in with Armand to show him how to get into the club the back way. Now, the back door symbolism is actually something we've seen a lot of too. And it's something that we have been trying to nail down pretty heavily since Find Me. That's kind of when we really started paying attention to it. So it's this constant theme of not using the front door, but going in either the back door or a side door or a different entrance, a different way to get in. And we've actually seen it for a long time. We just weren't always paying attention to it because we actually had it clear back in season 4 when they went to Terminus. We had Maggie and Glenn's group who went in the front door, but then Rick and Daryl's group went in a different way. They went in a back way. And I don't know, the symbolism it's a little unclear because with, if we stick with Terminus for a minute, with Maggie and Glenn's group going in the front door, it's not like things went very well. They still ended up in one of the train cars as prisoners. But we do know from what they said that they were kind of offered the possibility of joining Terminus, and when they didn't want to, they were put in the train car. So it's like the front door, there is an air of deception going on because the people will try to show you what they want to show you and get you to join them. Going in the back door, I think, creates more clarity, but they also end up generally in a really dangerous situation with like bullets flying and they have to run for their lives and that sort of thing. But at least they know the truth of this place and what's going on. We saw it with Leah, the first time Daryl ran into her cabin, he went in the back door and found her pointing a gun at him, and then he was taken prisoner. So we do kind of see this over and over again. And in this case, we saw it again. Daryl didn't go in the front door. He went in a different way with Armand, and he made it out okay, but he also did have to get in a fight with Quinn first. So there was definitely some danger there. So it's just a symbolism that we've seen a lot, and I haven't particularly done a deep dive on it so much as Galadriel Jones has done a lot more on it than I have, but you might have seen it when I post our conversations of us talking about it. So there's that. So just before they put this plan into action to go get Laurent, Isabel does tell Daryl that there's something she has to tell him, and he says, "Why don't you tell me at the river?" I won't go into the river's symbolism too much here, but the river can also represent a divide between life and death, and the river was a big part of Find Me, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the river symbolism. Even Sylvie, the younger nun, kind of upon hearing Isabel say that she had something she wanted to tell Daryl, wondered if it was that Isabel was developing feelings for Daryl. And so she asks her about it very directly when they're walking toward the river, and Isabel says no, that's not what she was going to tell him, and she was only concerned for him and Laurent. I think what she was going to tell him is that she was already thinking about going back to Quinn in exchange for him helping Laurent escape from Paris, which she does end up telling him at the river. But then we get this kind of really sweet blossoming romance between Sylvie and Emile, the French guy, and she kisses him. And then she tells Isabel all about it and says that it was both sweet and also confusing. And that just feels, the whole thing just feels like kind of a callback to Beth and Daryl. I mean, it's a very, very chaste, very sweet romance going on between them. And, you know, it's safe to say that neither of them have probably been in a romantic relationship before. I mean, we don't know that for sure about Emile because we don't really know anything about his past. But Sylvie being a nun, we know that she's never really had a boyfriend before or anything like that. And the fact that she says she's confused about it, I mean, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later this week in the Asks, but, you know, the writers like to say, and even Norman said afterward, that if Daryl had had romantic relationship or feelings for Beth, he didn't understand them. And so Sylvie's reaction, it just feels like very much a callback to Daryl in season 4 and what was going on between Beth and Daryl then. So that's really, really fun. I have a note about them. The guy they meet at the river, his name is Aslan. And I don't know if that's a more common name in France than it is in the States, but I can't imagine you can use that name and not expect people to think of the Chronicles of Narnia and C.S. Lewis's books. So I do think, I seem to remember saying maybe several years ago that there was something that stood out to me that was a callback to the Chronicles of Narnia, and I honestly can't remember what it was. I did a quick search and it didn't pop up for me, so I'm going to have to do a deep dive and see if I can find it in my index. I just remember it was like just one little thing that I was going, no, that's like a Chronicles of Narnia reference, and like I said, it was a couple of years ago, and it's not like we get them very often in the show, but again, I don't think you can use the name Aslan and expect people not to think of that story. So I'll look into that a little bit more and see what I can find. Quinn meets with Jeanette. He says that he has Daryl, and in exchange, he wants a Monet painting. She says Impressionism is a degenerate art. So again, this can be seen as a callback to Beth and Edward talking about art at Grady. It's really interesting that he wants that. I think in the show he's getting it for Isabel because he knows that she appreciates art. He also says he doesn't have Laurent when he does. So there's, like I said, there's some deception going on. It's also, we do have a sort of a hostage situation going on here. I mean, Daryl is trying to go get Laurent and bring him out because Quinn is essentially holding him hostage. So, again, lots of Grady callbacks, lots of interesting things. It even occurred to me that we could see Anna as a parallel to Dr. Edwards in the sense that neither of them were inherently evil. They're definitely self-serving and making some questionable choices, but Laurent says Anna is actually a nice person, and Edwards actually was a friend to Beth, even though, again, he did some very questionable things. So, again, just more parallels. I'm seeing them everywhere here. Daryl goes through the hatch with Armand, and, of course, Falou and the others attack the front door. Things go pretty well. Armand, hits Daryl and tries to escape, and then hurts his ankle, but in this case, Daryl just leaves him behind to be eaten, basically. And Emile at the front door ends up getting hurt. He gets shot in the leg. And both of those things, they do feel like callbacks to Beth hurting her ankle, even though, at least for Armand, obviously the outcome was different, but he specifically, I don't think he was supposed to have been bitten when Daryl comes upon him and finds him. I think because it was dark, he fell and hurt his ankle. And that's why Daryl told him he was an idiot, because he ran ahead and he didn't have a light, and then there was just a step down that he didn't see and he hurt his ankle, right? But then Emile gets shot in the leg, so we have all these people with a hurt leg, and it just feels like a callback to me. Finally, Daryl gets into the club, and he finds Laurent, and they end up leaving together. But of course, him and Quinn have to duke it out first. And yeah, there was no way in hell that Quinn was anywhere near as tough as Daryl. So we pretty much knew how that was going to end. But the interesting thing is that they're actually fighting on what you could call a bridge. I mean, it's a catwalk, but it's pretty much an indoor sky bridge. And then, of course, Daryl knocks him out. He doesn't actually kill him for Laurent's sake. He wants to, you can tell, but he doesn't want to have to do that in front of Laurent, so he doesn't. So finally, we get Laurent and Isabel, reuniting on the banks of the river, but she tells Daryl that they're not going to be able to get out of the city without help, and so she's going to go back to Quinn and, get him to make sure Laurent escapes, and she'll stay with him, which Daryl doesn't like that idea. Once again, we're going to have people saying that it's a romance thing. I really don't think it is. I see this almost very much as a Carol thing, because this is literally a past relationship of Isabel's that is quite toxic, is quite abusive. And so Daryl doesn't want her to have to sacrifice herself and go back into an abusive situation. And he understands an abusive situation because he's been abused. So I think that's where all of that is coming from. But she talks him into it and just says she'll find out some way to escape once she's there, once she's sure that Laurent has gotten out of Paris. And Daryl does agree to take Laurent the rest of the way to the nest. And so then we have the ending where we see Isabel. She does, in fact, go back to Quinn. And then Laurent and Daryl are kind of just watching Paris go by from the boat. It's kind of this really abstract but kind of lovely moment. And they pass the Eiffel Tower, and then they also pass the smaller version of the Statue of Liberty, which I think is a foreshadow of Daryl eventually going back to America. And, of course, it makes him think of home. Why wouldn't it? But I said at the beginning that there were several ladies of art in this episode. So the name actually translates to the Iron Lady, and that is a nickname for the Eiffel Tower. French people, the locals, call the Eiffel Tower the Iron Lady because it's made of iron. So, of course, that's like the most obvious thing it refers to. They go to the Eiffel Tower, Laurent sees it, he looks up at it, then they see it again on the river. But then I was thinking that it could also represent the Statue of Liberty, even though it's not made of iron. It is a lady, and it's a lady that represents America, who is known for being tough. So the Iron Lady. But then we also saw a depiction of the Mona Lisa, which I said was a foreshadow of them going to the Louvre, and it is, but she is a lady of art. She's often referred to as the lady with the mysterious smile. She knew a secret that she didn't tell, that sort of thing. In this case, they had basically made the likeness of the Mona Lisa into a walker, which is just kind of fitting for the show. So that was kind of fun. So yeah, there were a lot of interesting themes and a lot of callbacks in this episode. Once again, I'm sure there are plenty that I didn't even pick up on that people will send me during the week, and I will try to make them into edits and things like that so that we can see them. But yeah, there's just a lot of things that jumped out at me here. It felt like a very plot-driven episode again, like last week, but even so, there was a lot of sequences that were callbacks or parallels to things we've seen in season 4 or season 5. So now we have Daryl and Laurent on their own moving forward, and the next 2 episodes are supposed to be the best episodes of the season, and we're going to learn a lot of things, so I'm really, really excited for them. But I really liked this episode. I thought it was great. I thought the symbolism was great, and most of it makes me really, really happy for what's coming. Just a couple more quick notes before I wrap up. I did use Shazam to figure out the name of the song at the beginning. It is Cello Suite Number 1 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a very famous song if you want to look that up. With Daryl falling through the floor, I did forget to mention that it also could be a case of the hole in the roof theory. So I'll link to it in the show notes, but I have a lot of early posts on hole in the roof theories. We saw it a lot in season 5. There was a hole in the roof at the food bank, and there's just been a lot of that. So it may be part of the same symbolism, and we've kind of seen it as 2 different things. But like I said, if you want to read up on that more, I will link it. And then the one other thing that I forgot to talk about was the walker that actually comes after Laurent. So there were quite a few symbols in this episode. Like I said, the second walker that attacked Daryl under the water, he stabbed it in the eye. But there was Laurent looking through the gap in the sandbags, and then, this walker eye looks back at him, and it's super creepy. And then it's that same walker actually finds him underneath the piece of roofing or whatever it was that he was hiding under. So this walker was creepy. It seemed really intelligent, like it was sniffing him out or hunting him or something. But what I noticed was that we saw its eye several times. Obviously, it focused on that. And then on IMDb, the sort of thumbnail picture for this episode shows that walker's eye. So I feel like, the powers that be are going out of their way to focus on that eye. And it's just serious symbolism. I mean, that's what it is. It's return symbolism. And then, of course, paired with all of the, callbacks to Beth we had in this episode, I think that's super significant. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully that's all my notes. I'm sure I'll come up with more, but that's it for now. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have for today. I will be answering Ask the rest of the week, and I will put together things in edits so that you guys can see the parallels. And just, let me know what you thought of the episode. I hope you liked it too.